Hey, Kate, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. So, as always, I have a lot of questions here.
Yeah.
And for some reason, the first question I wrote is, why this book? Why right now? And as I'm reading that, I sound like some hard-hitting journalist, and that's not what I want to do. What I want to do is ask you, how did you come about feeling the need to write your new book, which is just out? It's called Strong as a Girl, Your Guide to Raising Girls Who Know, Stand Up For, and Take Care of Themselves. I'd love to know kind of a little bit about your story and what brought you to write this book.
Yeah. So it's a journey because of the space between conceiving of it and selling it and then actually being able to write it. So I have two girls. I'm a mom of two girls. And I was raised by a wonderful mom who instilled a lot of strength in me and taught me how to be strong and kind. And I dedicated the book to her. So it wasn't so much that I was trying to do something I didn't have, but I was just really thinking about what are the foundational aspects I want to make sure my girls have, knowing the challenges that, can face girls just in general in society, if anybody who is female identifying, as well as specific to the moment we're in. So that was the goal. This was kind of the book I always wanted to write. And I started working on it years ago. I don't even remember, maybe 2019. And at the time, when I first wrote the proposal, it was during the Me Too movement. And I think I might have even had a working tagline that was like raising the not me generation. It was really in response to that moment of people coming out and speaking openly about what they had experienced in the workplace, abuse, assault, etc. And so there was sort of that backdrop when I first created the proposal. And then many things happened. I did a podcast with Audible, and then I worked at a suicide prevention nonprofit, and time elapsed. And at the point that I started really getting it back out again with an agent, the landscape had changed. Like the conversations around gender and gender fluidity and neurodivergence and all these things had really exploded. And the Me Too movement, and it felt like a very empowered moment for girls. So there were different topics, but also like the moment felt still sort of very empowering. And then by the time, so then that's when I sold it. And then by the time I went, that it was, that I was writing it, we were in an era of this rise of misogyny. And so it's just been a whole journey. I mean, I think the themes are the same, right? It's about being comfortable. It's about supporting a girl, any elementary age kid who identifies as a girl, so ages 5 to 12. It's about supporting them in feeling good in their own skin and knowing how to advocate for themselves and, being strong in their body and strong in their mind. So all that applies to any of these number of sort of different, cultural moments we've been in or, expansion of our understanding of what it means to be a girl.
Yeah, as you're kind of talking about how the landscape has changed since 2019, that is a lot of disruption. And like, I can't even imagine like trying to write about this. You must always be kind of pivoting and realizing now, this lens has changed. And it is, especially right now, as this, book is coming out. What a fascinating time to be bringing a book about girls out into the world.
Yeah. In my opener, I talk about sort of examples of girls and women really like shining a light and showing the way for the next generation. And I say, I think I said from the halls of climate summits, thinking of Greta Thunberg, to the presidential campaign trail. And I kept waiting to see if that would turn to the White House, which it didn't.
It did not.
But yeah. But the presidential campaign trail was still a really strong place for a woman to be. Alas, yeah. I wasn't able to change that opening paragraph.
Yeah. Maybe in the updated and revised edition. Yeah. I mean, I will say, first of all, I really enjoyed your book. And I was, many, many years ago, before I started Tilda, I used to write books for teen girls and
that's right.
teen girls. And I always describe myself as a recovering teen, in my 30s. And part of why I wrote those books is because I did not have that messaging when I was a young girl. And I felt like I was learning things so late, things that I wish I had known when I was much younger, that I had adults in my life sharing these messages. So reading your book really kind of brought all of that back and just made me realize how powerful it is. And especially for the age group. And I wanted to ask you more about that, because I think most books on raising girls are focusing on the tween and teen years specifically, and you are looking at a younger demographic. So can you explain more about your reasoning for that?
Yeah. So most books are focused on the tween and teen years. And because of the nature of those years, they're kind of a lot about damage control, right? They're a lot about sort of what's already presented itself as a challenge, as an obstacle, and how do you navigate that? And I really felt like this was my approach with my girls, and the book I wanted to write was I wanted to like wade in when the water's shallow, the rocks are smaller, you can teach them the skills to swim so that when they hit the rapids downstream, both of you, she and you, feel more confident in managing them. And really just building a foundation to make parenting less scary for us too, not just to support the girls, but if you've put that time in early, not to say you won't hit the rapids, but you will feel more calm when you hit them. And the other thing is, it's just an easier, like wading into a conversation about, being the boss of your body when your kid's on the slide when they're 6 years old, is a much more mellow conversation than the one about when she's 16 and going on her first dates or whatever. And if you've laid the foundation early, you're practicing talking about the harder things, but in smaller ways. It's easier for both of you. And also, it's the time in life when kids are programmed to listen to you, to look to you for guidance. And so they're game for, your wisdom. And then when they hit adolescence, they're appropriately moving away from it. So it's like you've put the money in the bank and you can, draw the checks later.
Yeah. I mean, we are still kind of favored sources of information when we're, when we have little kids. They still really listen to us and respect what we have to say. Not that they don't when we're older, but we might not realize that they're listening to us or respecting our perspective.
Right. And they're developing their own core, right? So they're turning inward to see things. And so you want to be able to have done everything, at least I believe, you want to be able to have done everything to help them really know that core so that when they're making their own decisions and their own value judgments, it's coming from a place of real centeredness and self-knowledge.
So you and I had a chance to talk when you were researching this book, and I was really excited when you reached out to me because you wanted to be sure that you captured the experience of neurodivergent girls and those of us raising neurodivergent kids in this book, which always makes me excited because oftentimes we're kind of an afterthought, like, oh, and here's like a little paragraph on this. But this was you really wanted this book to kind of capture the complexity of being a girl in all the different ways, whether that's race or neurodivergence. Could you talk a little bit about that lens that you wanted to provide and how you went about doing that?
Yeah. I will say the impetus for it comes from my last book, Strong as a Mother, where I had a difficult pregnancy and I had very severe postpartum anxiety, and I felt very alienated by all the books that were out there about being pregnant. And there was no space for someone who felt so conflicted or who was having such a challenging time with it. And I've just taken that perspective forward, which is that I don't want a parent or caregiver to read this book and feel like, well, none of this applies to my kid, so now I'm alone again. And obviously I can't, create an encyclopedia of all topics, but I wanted to think about where are the areas where girls are living at the intersection of identities and that they could benefit from specific support related to those identities, and also have specific strengths related to those identities that should be talked about too. So I reached out to, first I made sure that the experts I spoke with, like you, I went to the experts for any topics that, I went to experts for the whole book because I'm a journalist, not an expert, but specific topics that I definitely know I am not qualified to speak on, such as living as a girl of color in America, LGBTQIA kids, neurodivergent kids and girls living with physical disabilities. So I knew I wanted to talk about experiences in different communities. So I reached out to experts who work in those communities. I reached out to caregivers whose kids are in those communities. And then I created focus groups with girls of, all kinds of girls, but I made some that were specific to a certain experience. So girls of color, neurodivergent girls and kids, LGBTQIA plus kids, so that we could be in a safe space and they could and essentially what I told all the girls in my focus groups was, and they were about ages 11 to 22. So it's girls and young women, because I was having them reflect back on their elementary years. I just said, look, let's pretend that we're in an auditorium of parents and caregivers, and you get to tell them how they should do this. Like, what were the things that when you were a child were really helpful related to being a girl, being a person, being someone with a physical disability. And then what were some things inputs you wish you had had, or experiences you wish you had had. And I took all that and sprinkled their words throughout the book. But those were hands down the best part of writing this book, was being in the rooms with those girls. I mean, I just didn't want our time to end. They were so insightful. They were so forthcoming. They were so naturally inclusive. They were positive and upbeat. They spoke about hard things, but they really had a bright outlook, and that just made me feel great. I mean, obviously. So, and they were just funny and enjoyable to be with. So that was one of the main ways I did that.
I do love that age group. I used to be a volunteer coach with Girls on the Run. And so that was like 3rd through 5th graders. And I just love that age group. Like they were so, just cool and open and interesting and so smart in ways that I wasn't when I was that age. I'm pretty sure. But it's fun that you got to spend that time with those girls. I'm curious to know, in addition to just how open they were and interesting, were there any kind of big surprises that came out of those focus groups?
That's a good question. Anger came up a lot, that they feel pressure that they can't express anger, and that, girls are expected to feel, to go along and get along, and emotions that they felt like. This one young woman out of Soye would say, like, she thought about deep things at age 6. And I have a deep thinking kid who's no longer age 6, but was at age 6 too. And people would say, you don't need to worry about that. That's not for you to think about. That's not a problem. And one of the big, things we know in the world of child development is that being able to experience all the emotions and express all the emotions is the key to being healthy and resilient. So the fact that a lot of them felt like either they didn't have a safe space to express the difficult emotions, or they felt like they were suppressed when they tried. Mm-hmm. And what else surprised me? The focus group with neurodivergent kids was fascinating and so enjoyable. This was literally the best 2 to 3 hours. I mean, it was the longest focus group I did, because these were all kids who were clearly getting supported at home for their differences and being celebrated for who they are. And I know that this wouldn't be the experience of everybody, but because of that, because their neurodivergence was something that was being celebrated, addressed, supported in their home, they interacted with each other. I mean, they ran the support group, and they, one of them, Goldie, really had a hard time not interrupting. And explain that early on. I interrupt. That's what I do. I just interrupt. And there was a lot of interruption in the beginning, and everybody else rolled with it. And then eventually they muted themselves. They said, I'm going to mute myself because I can't stop interrupting. But if I mute myself, then I won't be interrupting. Mm-hmm. And, you could see them animatedly wanting to respond to or responding to everything. But it was so self-aware, mm-hmm. and it was so comfortable with, I'm going to make this adjustment because this adjustment is good for me and this adjustment is good for you. And then similarly, the respect with which, when they differed about things, they talked to each other about it. Like, there was a genuine, I see you. I see, this thing about you. It is slightly different than this thing about me, but I want to let you know I see you. And also, I need to be able to say this. It's going to be different than what you just said, or whatever. It was, all the girls were very respectful of each other in all the groups, but it was the self-knowledge is really what stood out to me in that group. And I thought to myself, like, these are kids who, I'm sure their families go through struggles. They go through struggles, but they are seen for who they are. They are loved for who they are. They're supported for who they are. And, it was wonderful. And then by the end, they were all best friends, and they had all exchanged everything. And I was just sitting there while they chatted.
That's awesome. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. There's nothing like, and it doesn't happen all the time, but when neurodivergent kids hang out with each other, again, no matter what their differences are, there tends to be this kind of the surface level acceptance is just, it's a given, and you can just kind of move on. Like, there's no kind of judging about. That's been my experience. Again, not to say that that's the case for everybody, but that has been my experience. For sure.
And I think, I obviously reached out to parents who reached out to their kids to see if they wanted to participate. So again, we know that this is a supported, connected situation, well-resourced. There's a lot of things going into that. But it was phenomenal.
That's great. So a question that I have, Based on what I said earlier too about my own kind of personal search, I haven't raised, a girl from a young age. So even though I wrote books for girls, I always assumed I'd be parenting girls, but instead I was reparenting myself. So, and that's what a lot of neurodivergent parents are doing as they discover their own neurodivergence through their kids. There's a lot of reparenting, like this, I did not get this as a child. I want to provide this for my child. I'm wondering if that was part of your lens or how you kind of support parents, moms specifically reading the book, because presumably the generation you're talking to, there are many of those moms who did not have this kind of language provided for them, or they didn't grow up with it feeling strong as girls.
Yeah. My approach is that we all deserve support. Just every human being on the planet, we're deserving of dignity, care, support, respect, and space to be vulnerable and space to screw up. So my whole orientation toward parents and caregivers is like, this book is for you too. I'm not here to tell you should be doing this, and if you're not, it's bad. I'm here to say, here are some things that are really supportive for girls, and you may be doing a lot of them already. Some of them you may not have thought about. Some of them may be really challenging for you because of whatever your experience growing up was. And so there's room within all of that for error and excelling at some things and sucking at others and reaching out to people to help you with the things you suck at.
Mm-hmm.
That's not very self-compassionate language, but I'm being facetious. But and self-compassion. So I actually have a whole chapter on self-compassion, and I believe that is just as important for the caregiver and the mom, the dad, the grandparent, as it is for the girls, and that you can't really teach it if you don't practice it. So it's like a win-win. You get to learn how to take care of yourself again. And I think reparenting is the right word. Like in so many topics in my book, you're reparenting yourself. Body image is a big one, and that can feel very overwhelming for some people because of the difficult, relationship our culture has with bodies. But yeah, I try to always put in like space to screw up, space to check in with yourself about how you're feeling, and get yourself space, in big moments. If your kid's having huge emotions, how do you protect yourself also in that moment, as well as be there for them? Because it's a family, is a community, and, we are all part of a larger community. So I think we all deserve to feel strong in whatever that means for us,
I've never heard that, a family as a community. I love that. It's so true. Because you brought up self-compassion, I really love that chapter. And again, touched upon the self-esteem movement, which was definitely, that was the space in which I was writing for girls. It was all about self-esteem. It's like, no, now it's self-worth. And I love that you're like, actually, it's self-compassion. Could you talk about that a little bit more and why that's so critical?
Yeah. So I have to first say this is mostly from the research of Kristen Neff, who's the premier self-compassion researcher in the country. And she started out in the field of self-esteem as a grad student or PhD student, I can't remember. And they were quickly discovering that there were pitfalls related to self-esteem. That one, it's based on success. So, it's based on, I'm good at this. So then if you aren't good at something, your self-esteem isn't there to support you. That's really big for girls because girls derive so much, unfortunately, they do, because this is the water we swim in, they derive so much of their value from their appearance. They're told that that's their number one value, that's something they don't even have control over. So if their self-esteem is based on their appearance, it's not even something they're able to build in themselves, right? And so self-compassion is basically just accepting that you're human and that you've had an experience that is hard, and you want to give yourself some love for that experience, and also know that like that experience is what connects you to the world. You're suffering in whatever moment you're in. And then the support to, take care of yourself and move forward and figure out, what do I need next? And so self-compassion, really, if you're able to forgive yourself and be with yourself when you've messed up, when things are hard, that is a huge factor in your resilience.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are great examples in the book of how to do that and language that we can use. That is one of the things I've done a lot as a parent is when I notice I'm verbally beating myself up, I'll say, you know what, I'll just like out loud, I'll say, I'm going to be nicer to myself. I'm going to say this differently because this is just part of the human experience. But I love that you include examples in there of language that we can help our girls kind of start to say to themselves when they are being especially hard on themselves. Going back to what you were just saying, that their self-worth or self-esteem is often based on appearance. You wrote that research shows that by the time girls are 8, 9, and 10 years old, they can no longer see themselves from the inside, that they tend to only see themselves from the perspective of other people and how they're reflected in the eyes of other people. That kind of blew my mind that that happens at such a young age. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, that came from Soraya Chemali. It's just that girls are taught to embrace a gaze because they're looked at with this gaze, right? They're looked at with so much focus on their appearance, how they present, being nice. I think boys need a ton of support, and I think we can do a way better job supporting boys in becoming strong too. But they don't get held to those standards. They're sort of allowed to be messy. And that's problematic in themselves because they get ignored, right? When they're probably being messy because they need support. But they're allowed to be messy and girls are not. They're praised for, when they raise their hand. They're praised for when they stand in line. They're praised for when they share or are kind to a friend. And so they come to conflate their goodness with being good versus just their goodness for being a person, so that you can, your teacher can call you out because you didn't stand in line the right way or, whatever it is, and you can still be a good person, even though you made a choice that in that moment wasn't the choice people wanted you to make.
And these aren't just things that we're doing in our homes, right? Like as parents, we need to counter messages because I'm assuming these are like ubiquitous throughout society and schools and all the kind of environments our kids are interacting with.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one thing that is a challenge because I write in the parenting book space, but we have such an inflated sense of our influence over our kids. And, they are in the sea of education, social media, peers, and we're one input, So it is something like, for instance, with appearance, I just decided when my kids were an early age that I was never going to comment on their appearance. Now, I think I may have taken it too far in the other direction. But, whatever they wore to school, they wore to school. Even if it was like maybe not appropriate for the weather, I might say, hey, bring a jacket in case you get cold or whatever. But I let them choose. I didn't say if things weren't matching. I didn't tell them to brush their hair. I didn't say, let's do a nice hairdo. If they got interested in that, which my older daughter definitely did, and now my younger daughter who's in middle school is starting to have that same inclination, then of course I supported it if it was coming from them. Mm-hmm. But if they were like, how does this outfit look? I would say, how do you feel? How do you feel in it? And, and how do you feel about it? And are you comfortable? Always I focused on that. So there were certain areas where I knew everybody else was going to be on that train and I didn't need to be on that train.
Yeah. Yeah, makes total sense. So you mentioned earlier that your favorite 2 to 3 hours in working on this book was when you were sitting down with neurodivergent girls. And so I'm wondering what you learned from that, or what did you want to share in the book that's so important in terms of maybe additional challenges that neurodivergent girls are facing at this age?
Yeah. Well, so one of the big things that came up in those focus groups and in the experts I talked to is just what we were just talking about, these expectations about how girls are going to behave. And, one of the girls in my focus group, Jillian, was like, the world expects girls to be nice and quiet and not loud and noisy. And my neurodivergence makes it impossible for me to do that. Like I will be loud, I will be noisy. And so there's sort of that direct like experience of being female, experience of being neurodivergent, confluence there. I think, just specific to neurodivergence, but applicable to the whole book, is just really helping girls feel good in their own skin, especially if they have, some aspect of themselves that, other people are going to point out is a reason for them not to belong, not to fit in. And so really emphasizing from an early age, being open about, and bunch of this I learned from you. So being open about a diagnosis early, being really open to whatever their experience of that is, not trying to label it or force them to feel a certain way about it, letting them have their own journey with it. I think I don't think this came up in the neurodivergent section, but maybe in the physical disabilities section, being able to say as a parent, like, we're going to work through this together. Like, I don't have all the answers. I mean, no parent does, but especially in a situation where you're, as a parent, navigating a new reality that you've maybe never navigated before, being able to say to your kid, I am here and we will figure this out together and we will get the right supports together. You don't have to be an all-knowing person. And that can be a really lovely journey that you guys share. And they can give you input, which is one of the huge things I'm trying to emphasize in the book, is just listening, just pausing and listening to girls so that they know people want to hear what they have to say. It reinforces their own sense of themselves and the world and how they view it, and makes them feel heard, And so all of those things, the experience of being a person, really, but I'm talking about girls in this book. But the thing I say in the front of the book, so there is that section that you mentioned where I do more of a deep dive into girls of color, neurodivergent girls, LGBTQIA kids, girls living with physical disabilities. And I say in the front of the book, like, choose your own adventure here. Like, if you can read it all the way through, and I hope you do because I wrote it and that's how I make my living. But if you've got one issue, if eating disorders, I have a huge section on eating disorders. If that's what you're dealing with, feel free to jump ahead. And then I talked about the fact that I'm going to talk to specific identities and experiences. And I was like, I encourage you to read that section of the book, even if your child doesn't relate to those identities, or you think they don't, which, by the way, you may not know when they're 6. You probably don't, because of the concept of universal design, right? Yeah. So, I'm sure you've talked about it a lot in your podcast. We know that, like, when we have, ramps for wheelchairs, they benefit people with strollers and joggers and everybody else. And similarly, like, the same openness and supportiveness with which you would talk with your daughter about her autism diagnosis and letting her know that she is exactly who she needs to be, and she will get the support to continue to be who she needs to be, is the same openness that would help any girl do anything, right? Yeah. So I think those are some of the specific things we talked about, and just making space for feelings and, changes on your neurodivergent journey, and a lot of agency, I think. And actually that was big in the physical disabilities section. Because girls living with physical disabilities are often, treated as if they have absolutely no agency over their bodies. Yeah. And one of the girls in one of the young women in one of the focus groups said, it wasn't until I was 19 that a doctor actually addressed me in a wow. visit and said, "This is your body. I'm not going to tell you what to do with it." Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So that's, if you're living with a physical disability, being in charge of your body, there's a whole nother layer added to it, that the whole medical profession, I'm sure there's good providers out there, but a lot of the medical profession and people in general are going to think that you don't have control over your body. You don't want control over your body. And so that's a whole nother layer to fight, to say that I am in my body and I do have control and I do have a say, and this body is for me and not anybody else. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. There's so many things. Sorry, I talk a lot. No, I love it. I'm like, where do I go? Because there's so many things I want to touch upon. First of all, the last thing you just said, my body is for me. You mentioned that that's one of your favorite 5 words that you learned in writing this book. And it is such a powerful concept. And I want to mention that you talked with Emily Ladau, who we've had on the show, and she wrote Demystifying Disability. And so I really appreciated her insights that you shared in the book. Circling back to universal design, you talk with Amanda Morin, who is a friend of the show, mutual friend of ours, I know. And she wrote, most recently, she wrote her book, Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, with Emily Kircher-Morris. But what I loved about that book that you were just touching upon too, is this idea that what's good for neurodivergent people is good for everybody, right? And that's such a powerful takeaway. And I did want to mention a quote of Amanda's that I pulled out that I loved. It's not about overcoming, it's about becoming. Yeah. Would you kind of share what she meant when she was saying that? Well, I think she was speaking specifically to neurodivergence and disability, and the idea that, these are obstacles that you have to overcome, that's the kind of classic narrative. And she was saying, you don't need to be anything more than what you are and who you are, and she was talking about how there's a lot of pressure, and some of the girls in the focus group that I had spoke to this, that if you, like Emily said, because I was in a wheelchair, because I move in a wheelchair, I felt like I had to be an excellent student. Or one of the girls in the neurodivergent group, Kat, said, just because I am, neurodivergent and I have a big imagination doesn't mean I love art. Or, don't ascribe things to me or have things that have to make up for, right? That just you are just who you are, and you're just going to grow more and more into that. Yeah. And I think that applies, I have a section on introversion. When I say strong as a girl, doesn't mean you have to be out there like this. If that's your personality, if that's who you are, great. But if you're introverted, wonderful. Let's find out where you would like some support to be more extroverted, because we know the world runs on extroverts. So let's find out where you feel like you want some support to speak up or engage more. And then let's respect when you don't want to. And let's respect, and let's give you space and time. None of this is about becoming a certain kind of girl. It's all about just being the girl you are, that you came into this world as, or that you're becoming in the case of, a child who's gender fluid or a transgender, and just becoming more of that person.
Yeah.
Allowing all of us being able to get out of our own heads, because we're in a society that tells us 1,000 messages about how to raise kids, get out of our own way and just see that this is a person in front of us with incredible self-knowledge and intuition. And our privilege and responsibility is just to give her the space to experience that. And that's actually less work for you. Yeah. I think we feel like we have to work so hard, but actually pausing, listening, letting her, drive the car when she's ready and can, is actually less work for you.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And really infused throughout the whole book is this message of encouraging our kids' autonomy, sense of agency, always making sure girls know that they are in control and they get to decide. And that my body is for me. And you talk about it in relationship with food and kind of all different aspects of life. But I love that kind of message, agency, respect. That's what we're doing here. There's so many other things I want to touch upon, but I also want to be mindful of the time. So let's kind of wrap it up with my last question here. If parents did just one thing consistently from the ages of say 3 to 10 to nurture a strong inner voice in their girls, what would you say that should be? Where should we be? What's the most bang for the buck, perhaps?
Listening more than you talk. Yeah.
So easy to do, right?
So easy. I mean, yeah, no problem. Because we're not busy with 1,000 things. And, I have one little tidbit there, which is, I have one child who externally processes at all times, from the moment she wakes up to no, she's a little quiet in the morning, but till she goes to bed. And there's no way I can listen to all that. There's no way I can be present for all that. And so we've developed something, and actually I think my husband and I developed it when we were dating, called a keyword. So if they're talking to me and I'm in the middle of writing a work email, or I'm stressed, whatever it is that I know I'm not accessible, I'll say, I'm so sorry. I really want to hear what you're saying, but I just can't right now. But give me a keyword and I'll ask you about it at dinner or when we're in the car or whatever. Just give me a keyword to remind me what it is you want to share with me. So I'm showing them that I respect, that I want, that I am interested and I truly want to hear, but I'm also a human and there's no way I can do that at all times.
I do that to some extent, but not with the keyword. So I'm going to incorporate that into my parenting.
The problem is, as you get older, you forget the keyword. So my husband and I'll tell each other, we'll be like, keyword this. And then later he's like, oh, you gave me a keyword. And I'm like, yeah, I don't remember.
It's gone.
I don't remember what a keyword is.
Classic. I also just want to mention Katie Hurley is in your book quite a bit, and we're also huge fans of hers.
Yep.
And there's a question that you shared that goes along with this idea of listening. And you're talking about teaching girls how to tolerate difficult emotions. And the question is, hey, you don't seem like yourself today. What's different? And I was just like, that is just such a gentle, loving, curious question. And I just so appreciated that. Questions like that and suggestions for how to talk about things are, again, kind of infused throughout the book. And they're so helpful because it's just, again, wasn't modeled for so many of us to talk to our girls this way.
Yeah. Well, Katie's a professional, and so she knows, open-ended questions, but exactly what's different. There's something about that question that makes someone's wheels turn, right? They're going to think of, even if they don't want to tell you, they're going to think to themselves, what's different? Why am I feeling this way or that way?
Yeah.
But I do think, tell me more is my favorite, because, if a kid comes to me, one of my kids comes to me with something, especially if it's a big topic, especially if it's something that could be upsetting to, both of us, like, that's a way to let me pause. Tell me more. And also then my answer or my support will be much more targeted to what they actually need. Gives me a minute to breathe. If it's like, someone was being super mean to me at the playground, or this guy sent me this text in the case of, a teenager, just tell me more before you jump in. I think is huge. And the reason I do include so much, conversation starters, mantras, is because when you read a book and it's like, have an open conversation with your kid about sex. Well, if you're a parent who knows how to have an open conversation with your kid about sex, you got it, more or less. I mean, sure, there's improvements or changes or support you could have. But if you don't know how to have an open conversation, does someone telling you to have an open conversation help you? Like, it doesn't, what does that mean? I don't know. Yeah. I'm not comfortable having an open conversation. Like, how do I start? What's the baby steps? So I try to put those things throughout the book to give, like, a concrete way to try out what I'm talking about or what an expert is talking about.
Yeah, it's so helpful. Let me ask you one last question then, for listeners who are raising daughters and who are listening to this and they're realizing or just thinking, gosh, I haven't been doing this the way that I would like to. How do you help parents, or what would you say to them about changing course?
Thank you for asking that, because that is a huge theme of the book. I would say that making mistakes and then making repairs is some of the most powerful parenting work you can do. And it's them seeing you be human. It's them seeing you be responsive to them. You know what I figured out? It turns out, like, this isn't the best way for me to talk about whatever the topic is. So I'm going to work on changing it. I may not get it right every time, but I realize now that that's not the most useful way or helpful way to do it. This is a very small example, but after I wrote the intuitive eating chapter, I realized that, like, every week when we get sushi from the takeout place and my daughter had one piece of broccoli in her udon, and I'd be like, did you eat the broccoli? Can you eat the broccoli? Would you just eat the broccoli? And then they're like, that's not how you get your kid to eat broccoli. And it's actually really harmful and whatever. And so that I was like, the next time we got it, I was like, so by the way, I've learned from writing my book that that's not the most helpful thing. So I'm not going to, you decide if you eat your broccoli. So kids are so forgiving and they appreciate honesty. And so you always have a chance to say, gosh, there's a better way to do this, and I didn't know about it till now, and I'm going to try. And also, there are topics like body image, potentially raising a neurodivergent kid. If you have neurodivergent experience growing up that is, really traumatizing in the way you were treated, there are some topics that you might need support to support your girl with. And that's okay. Like, if talking about, food is just that hard for you because of whatever you were raised with, whatever messages you got, I really recommend getting some professional support for you so that you can process and be kind to yourself, and then be supportive to your girl. And I do include a lot of low cost and culturally responsive mental health resources.
Yeah. Tons of resources at the end of every chapter, books that people should read, organizations. It's super practical and super helpful. Listeners, again, the book is called Strong as a Girl, Your Guide to Raising Girls Who Know, Stand Up For, and Take Care of Themselves. Kate, it's a fabulous book, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And where would you like people to connect with you?
Sure. Well, they can find the book anywhere books are sold. And I am on Instagram at Kate Rope Writer. My Substack is Strong as a Human, and katerope.com.
Awesome. So listeners, as always, I will have links in the show notes to all of those places and to the book. And thank you. Congratulations again. Thanks for everything that you shared with us today.
Thank you. And thank you for your help with the book.
My pleasure.